Three Guns from Colorado by Peter Field. Read by Mr. Stuff and Such. Chapter 1. Crusty Hodge, the grizzled, slope-shouldered handyman, stood on the back porch of the Lazy Mare ranch house, dish rag in hand, and watched the rider jog into the yard. He was one of the ranch hands. The afternoon was declining, and it was not yet be long until supper, and he threw a long blue shadow as he rode. Grasping a bundle of mail in his free hand, he came on towards Pat Stevens, who had paused, straight-shouldered and vigorous, at the foot of the porch steps. "There's a telegram here. Come on up on the stage from Hopewell Junction," the rider announced. "Winters thought that you'd want it right off." Pat accepted the proffered bundle, smiling wryly. "Thanks, Tommy. When anyone bothers to send a telegram, it generally means the news is more important to him than it is to you. But I'll buy it this time." He sorted through the envelopes and odd bills, and tearing open a yellow envelope, absorbedly studied the telegram form it yielded up. Following all this in a silence, Crusty Hodge was consumed with a lively interest. His rheumaty eyes squirmed, and Pat Stevens had a hand in many and diverse affairs with which the aging rustabout yearned for a greater familiarity. But he had learned not to ask idle questions of this man, whose tongue could be sharp-edged on occasion. His errand done, the puncher drifted away, and still Pat stood rock-like in the failing light, frowning at the message as if turning something over in his mind. He had not finished when one of the men working in the corrals called to him hoarsely. "Hey, Stevens! Hey!" Pat turned to look that way, his clean-cut face alert. Sunset-colored dust boiled in the pen as the horse they were working was stamped and torn about and scattering the men. He saw Johnson, his foreman, leap forward with a whistling rope. Absently tossing his mail on the top step, Pat hastened towards the corral to watch the fun. Hodge followed the long-legged progress only briefly, the handyman's eyes straying again to the bunch of mail, temptedly discarded at his feet. The telegram lay on top. Not for anything would Crusty have touched it, rabid as his curiosity now was concerning its contents, but it was left spread open. The old man craned his stringy neck as his glance followed the printed lines. "Deal, set, stop. Meet you, El Castra, October 20th, it read, and it was signed Connor. Hodge's lean cheeks sucked in as he considered. He was vaguely disappointed. The telegram conveyed nothing to him beyond the fact that his employer presumably had been involved in some undescribed business transaction. The uprail at the corral, he saw, was ending in the manner of all contests between beast and man. Pat and the punchers were laughing and talking. A moment later, hearing an ominous sizzling from the kitchen stove, the handyman bobbed back inside once again. Crusty Hodge was a man of one methodical pace, and his thoughts were simple. Jogging towards Dutch Springs the following morning in the ranch wagon, he was still thinking hazily about the telegram, having just reached the point of realization that Pat Stevens, in all likelihood, would be taken on a trip shortly, leaving him in undisputed possession of the Lazy Mare ranch house, but, on the other hand, pitted without defense against the crew of punchers for whom he was forced to prepare meals. Grumpy over this unfortunate but unavoidable prospect, on reaching the little cow town which served Powder Valley, Hodge filled his modest needs at Winter's general store, employing a minimum of speech, and then, as it was his custom, retiring hastily to the Gold Eagle saloon. Half an hour later, he was still there. A pudgy man in soiled overalls, with button bright eyes and blue stubble jaws, shoved up alongside him. "Hiya, Crusty. How's that sidewinder Stevens making out?" Hodge regarded the little man owlishly. All right, he hiccuped. Behind his interrogator, he vaguely perceived a lanky, red-headed, one-eyed individual. Howdy, Ezra. There was always something ragged about Ezra's lean jaw grin. Vacation time again, eh? He rumbled. Pat can't be short-handed, that's sure. What's he doing? Krusty swayed gently, taking them in. His eyes glazed in concentration. There's a telegram, he articulated finally. Said come a-running and meet October 20th. That's what it said, yes, sir. Come again? Ezra invited politely. Hodge obliged, as he did before. What's all this? Janelle and Sam Salone sobered swiftly, an inkling of the truth reaching his alert mind. Telegram, you say? Something Pat Stevens got, Krusty? Yep. The handyman nodded importantly. Feller named Connor. His gloom had been banished in the sunshine of John Barleycorn's smile, and Krusty grew voluble, if not explicit. Sam and Ezra succeeded at length in extracting from him the information that Pat had received a message requiring his presence a long ways off on the 20th of the month. Where'd you say it come from? Ezra demanded for the 4th or 5th time. Arizona, Hodge repeated, so positively that they could no longer doubt. The two shag-bark rawhides, hardened old reprobates in appearance, and cronies for many a year, gazed at each other with undisguised alarm. Ezra and Sam Salone had known Pat Stevens almost from his childhood. They had passed through innumerable scraps at the younger man's side. They'd watched him grow from an irresponsible urchin into a man of considerable authority, in his time a law enforcement officer of report, and now owner of a prosperous ranch. Perhaps the transition had been too rapid, for not yet could the two bring themselves to believe entirely in Stephen's level-headed responsibility, or so they pretended. What dang fool! Ezra burst out gruffly. Rushing off to Arizona. Indignant scorn rang in the words. It don't make no sense, Sam concurred worriedly. Wonder what it's all about. Pat ain't said a word, and that he means to sneak off alone. We ought to be putting a stop to that. Stop it? Ezra snorted. Just tell me how you're going to stop that hellion if he sets his mind to something. They argued the matter hotly without getting anywhere. What you reckon Pat be up to way out there? Krusty managed to insert helpfully. It was precisely the question which bothered them. Well, he don't know that country, Sam declared plainly. He'll get himself in trouble for sure. The thought rendered the partners, joint owners of the Barry S. Horse Ranch down south of the valley, empty of expression. Ezra was the first to shake off the depression, hiding his secret eagerness to share in whatever might be going on afoot. Suppose maybe we just have to look into this, he grumbled, with a special uncertainty. Thanks for telling us, Krusty. We'll have us a talk with Stevens. Hodge waved a hand as they turned away. Connor, muttered Sam to himself on the street, repeating the name the handyman had mentioned. Who does Pat know by that name? Sounds familiar somehow, returned Ezra, wrinkling his craggy brows. I've heard it, but I can't seem to place it. You know, only you don't know, Sam snarled sarcastically. That's sure a big help. It was not by accident that the pair rode out to the Lazy Mare that afternoon, where they found Stevens busy repairing a sagging corral. What are you two hairpins up to now? Pat grinned, eyeing them shrewdly. I ain't seen you in a dog's age. Well, that's just it. We're paying our respects, Sam told them with dignity. If it's gotten so that you plumb forgotten a couple of broken-down, wore-out old friends. Sam's disrespectful laughter interrupted him. "Yes, sir. Spavined old war horses with one leg in the grave, that's you all right," he grunted shortly. They fell into a discussion of range matters, a topic of never-failing interest, however unexcited in this quiet season. Elaborately casual, Ezra and Sam waited alertly for the introduction of the one subject upmost to their minds. It didn't come, despite a number of obvious openings. Anything but the usual humdrum of ranch management seemed far removed from Pat Stevens' thoughts. The chagrined pair took their leave at last, baffled and not a little nettled. "Well, dang his hide!" Ezra ejected forcefully, after a period of gloomy rejection. "Well, he's got something big up his sleeve." "Must be if he won't let us in on her." "Well," the big one-eyed redhead was grim, "he ain't getting away with it." Sloane perked up, his pudgy bulk straightening. "Well, that's a ticket," he approved, nodding. We'll just shove up and spoke into his wheel. He needs it, trying to give us the cold shoulder like that." Nothing was too much trouble for them when their secretive friend was concerned. For 2 days they took turns riding across the range to maintain a lookout on the lazy mare by means of a pair of glasses. On the second evening, Sam came pelting up the cottonwood-shaded bar-esque cabin to haul his horse in sharply. "Reckon this is it," he called to his lanky partner, stepping down. "Pat was going over a saddle pretty carefully on his porch today, and the boys they tacked on some new shoes onto his horse. He'll be pulling out for sure in the morning." Without comment, Ezra hauled a worn pack saddle out of the shed, and Sam began to bring supplies from the cabin, piling them up on the bench where they could be checked out for stowing. The two worked silently, efficiently, and without pause. Ezra drove a pair of sturdy saddle horses and a pack animal up from the pasture. They were soon ready. Sam's last act was to check their Winchesters and thrust them securely behind the pack ropes. "Straight south and round the end of the Cumberlas towards Santa Fe, I reckon?" Ezra queried as he settled into the saddle. Sam nodded. "Likely as anything. We best check on it." Sunset was dyeing the buttes a ghostly orange as they pulled away from the bar-es. Meadowlarks swooped over the painted range, dripping liquid song. No road led the way they were going. Even the trail a hurried traveler would logically follow was rugged. At full dark, they pitched camp in the pines, and expectations of the morrow held them tense and tight. Early light found them on their way once more, their first purpose being to obtain a respectable lead. All day, one or the other looked back repeatedly. The empty slopes lay open and peaceful, the ridges smiling in the sun. By late afternoon they were high up the raw Cumberla flanks, and as yet they seen no trailing horsemen to their rear. Sam grew fidgety, and a little knot of concern drew on Ezra's bushy brows. Topping a pine-fringed pass leading over a rocky and eastward-running spur of the mountains, they drew up rein. And still the trail behind them lay empty, though they were able to scan it for miles. "He's got to come past here," Sam grunted tensely. "Well, we'll give him a couple more hours." But dusk mantled the lonely wilderness while they watched, and the expected tiny figure failed to appear. "You reckon he went another way?" Ezra worried, as they threw a small supper together. "Well, how would I know?" Sam snapped, his tone measuring his uncertainty. "Never was a time when Pat Stevens did what you'd expect him to do." The night dragged on. It was cold this high up, and they kept a fire going. Ezra stamped about in the morning, slapping his arms about him to start the circulation. "Well, now what?" "Well, who knows?" For the 5th time in a dozen minutes, Sam moved out to gaze down the slopes, rosy in the fresh morning, and suddenly he stiffened. Oh, here he comes!" he exclaimed. Ezra crowded forward to peer, and he nodded. Tenseness caught up with them, and in a twinkling they got ready and shoved off, not proposing to let Stevens catch them, obviously on the watch. An hour later, starting up a long pine-clad slope, Pat was startled by the crashing echo of a rifle coming from above. Studying the trail, he had been wondering who was ahead of him. Whoever they were, they appeared to be warning him off in an unmistakable manner. Not one to be driven out of the road, Pat's jaw tightened. That shot had been deliberately wide, slashing the scrub brush a dozen yards to his right, yet it acted like a challenge. Pat pulled quietly off the trail into the pines and drove up the slope at a tangent, crossing a dip and angled back towards the trail. He had lost no time. A rock outcrop nearby served his purpose. He was waiting behind the bulge, keyed for decisive action, when the scrape of hoofs and the matter of voices had advertised the approach of two men. And when they were close, Pat shoved abruptly into the open, and one glimpse of that pair and he froze, his face going expressionless. "Oh, you, huh?" The first to speak, Ezra, sounded both relieved and vexed. "Yeah, it's me." Pat looked them over accusingly. "Where are you two heading, if a fella might ask?" "Never you mind." Sam was superior and disgusted. "You ain't going with us, if that's your idea. We didn't know who was coming up behind us, but it make no difference." Pat's flat lips twitched. "Okay, then just let me pass," he protested tolerably, "and you won't be seeing me again." Sam stared. "You mean that you're heading this way too?" Ezra also permitted himself to show a mild curiosity at this. "My, aren't we busy? Just from where you be going off to?" he inquired. Pat's casual glance did not altogether hide the twinkling lurking deep in his slate-colored eyes. "Well, I'm riding down to Arizona to look at a ranch," he admitted finally. It was more than either of the partners had bargained for. "Well, you don't mean you're going to buy it?" ejected Sam. "Why not?" Pat's scrutiny sharpened. "Southern cattle are cheap and they fatten up fast here in Colorado. But playing the open market down there's a losing game. If this spread looks good, I'll buy it and stay long enough to get it going under a competent manager." Ezra thought the project foolhardy and promptly said so, but Pat soon convinced Sam that his reasons for owning an Arizona ranch were sound. He had a long head, the little man knew, and his schemes had paid off in the past. "Where were you two sashaying off to when I interrupted?" Pat broke off to ask pointedly. The partners exchanged glances. "A place called Sulphur Springs Valley," Sam supplied blandly. "Reckon that's down in Arizona, too." Pat managed to hide his smile. "Yeah, not too far from the San Pedro country where this ranch is. What's the attraction down there?" he pursued. It developed through Sam's glib talk that they had gotten wind of some horse stock thereabouts that was worth looking into. The West was full of wild Mustang horses, by no means to be ignored, but this was said to be Morgan strain stock, which they hoped to procure for their horse ranch. "Worth a longish trip, I suppose," Ezra concluded stoutly. "Oh, yeah, it'll be worth it." Pat wiped his mouth with his palm, leaving it sober. "Well, shall we get on our way?" He pulled up Jigger, his horse, into the trail. The other two agreed, well satisfied they'd earned the tacit invitation to travel with them by the attempted means of guile. But it was sufficient, if neither of them noticed it, that not one of them of the three, then nor afterwards, remarked on the single coincidence of their having met in just such a fashion. "You must be carrying a sizable amount of money," was all Pat said. "Expect that's why you're trying to warn me off there back at the pass." Sam slapped his ample waist, indicating the hidden money belt. "It's all safe, but you must have a wad along yourself, too." Got a bank draft. It's a bit easier and lighter to carry, Pat affirmed. Once they were settled into an easy companionship, the miles reeled behind them. Taos was passed by, Santa Fe knew them by night, and they dropped down into the Rio Grande Trough and climbed the plateau. Lagman Indians sold them food, and 2 days later, the New Mexican cattle range behind them. They crossed over into Arizona. Reaching Quemando late, they pulled up there. Sam, looking the town over, one street, 1,000 yards long, laying in a bushy depression. Saddle horses stood in the rotted mud. None of the log or adobe buildings were over 1 story high. In the midst of a cattle-strewn desolation, this was a metropolis. But Sam remained kind of unimpressed. Not much excitement here. You're looking for any? Pat grinned. At last they ate heartily, sizzling, delicious beefsteaks. A saloon keeper offered them a tumble-down shack off the alley behind his place for the night. Not even poker held Ezra at the table after 10 o'clock. They propped up the bunks in the airy shack, blew out the lantern, and crawled in. Crang! Crang! The echoing clamor pierced their consciousness, jerking them broad awake in the middle of the night. Sam banged his head on the bunk overhead and started to sputtering. What in the tarnation's that? Ezra bawled. Again the rolling, clanging burst upon their ears. In the heavy silence, it was enough to wake the dead. It's that old wagon tire they're using for a fire alarm, Pat grunted, struggling into his boots. Come on, let's get out there. It was only a moment before he yanked back the sagging door and sprang out. Ezra was not far behind him. Clumsy by reason of his bulk, Sam was the last to be ready. Muttering his exasperation, he burst outside and set off a-running. He was still attempting to thrust his arm into his coat when he reached the mouth of the alley. A red glare came from somewhere beyond. The crack and roar of flames was now so loud that Sloane heard nothing else clearly. It came to a total surprise when a man loomed up before him suddenly, running the other way. They collided heavily. The other man ricocheted into the alley, scrambling up and cursing, and ran on. Intent on the fire, Sam took a couple steps that way and stopped. Hey, that hombre was rustling the wrong way, he thought swiftly. Turning, he stared at the black mouth of the alley, and after a second's delay, he moved back to peer in cautiously. There was light at the other end, enough for him to see the dark figure stealing down the alley, and to Sam's amazement, the man moved directly to the door of their own shack. What's going on here? He muttered tightly. He was about to shove forward when a second fleeting figure appeared in the alley, and Sam recognized that lean silhouette. It was Pat, and he ran in swiftly to plunge at the man slipping in at their door. Sam heard the crash and the roar of wrath as they went to the door together. Before he could move, the 2 other figures materialized into the gloom, charging into the shack. While Sam, he vented a growl. The odds Pat was up against was more than enough to send Sloane hurtling forward. Beyond the gaping door, the shack was in darkness, but Sam dove in pell-mell, and he came up against the wall and froze, panting. A table clattered somewhere, and there was some muffled grunts, and Sam pushed forward. The first form he encountered promptly went hurtling towards the entrance, and he groped about for a fresh assailant. The place was too small for much freedom of action. Someone barged into him, and Sloane was knocked into a bunk, crashing into it, and he rose like a bear, hugging the man who was backing against him and flung him sprawling. A yell of pain rang out. With a scramble of boots, a figure darted through the door and vanished another. Sam clasped his stinging fist and paused. The retreating slap of boots sounded from the alley outside, and the little man started to grope around. Hold it, Sam, Pat yelled. They're washed up. They stilled, breathing heavily. A match flared, and they looked about. The prowlers were gone. End of chapter 1.